Even by 1928 standards, the world thought they were crazy. They were in a part of the Arctic no man had ever explored before. Cowered in the shadow of their crumpled Fokker aircraft, two relentless explorers from opposite sides of the world, Australian George Wilkins and American pilot Ben Eielson. Flight, their lifelong obsession. But their obsession had already cost one person their life. Frostbite and cruel 50 below temperatures would soon claim the pilot's finger. Their crippled aircraft had only a temperamental hand-cranked radio. With the uncertainty of wireless communication, Wilkins would write, we had resigned ourselves to the fate of walking. Bracing against the brutal Arctic cold, the explorers staggered from the wreckage. Alone in the harshest part of the world, it would be weeks before they would reach civilization. The residents of Hatton, North Dakota claim the Hatton of 100 years ago looks decidedly similar to the Hatton of today. Founded in 1880, this tiny farming community remains an unlikely place for aviation to take flight in North Dakota.
In the continental United States, North Dakota would probably be the toughest place to live. Those bitter cold, those minus 30-degree days with wind chill minus 1,000,000 and constant wind blowing around. It's a tundra.
The history of the state as pertains to aviation is something that you wouldn't find anywhere else in the country.
This was a really risky profession for those pilots. You're really pushing the envelope.
Ben Eielson was born in Hatton in 1897, one of 9 children to Norwegian immigrant parents. His father, Ole, a local shopkeeper, fully expected his children to follow in his footsteps. Ole Eielson was the first person in Hatton to own an automobile. But Ben, as he liked to be called, was a notably fearless and adventurous child, fostering outsized ambitions. Ole watched for hours from afar as his son flew a kite outside of town.
In that early golden age period of aviation, pilots had a vision. They saw this, supposed fad at the time taking, pardon the pun here, but taking off.
Only 1,600 miles separate Kitty Hawk and Hatton, but at the turn of the century, those cities felt an entire world apart.
Aviation really got a slow start. It was a pretty polarizing topic, back in the day.
In North Carolina, Wilbur and Orville Wright, curious tinkerers turned bicycle makers, were pioneering engined flight. They selected the gusty, isolated dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina for its light winds and soft sand. They obsessively tracked their attempts.
Those were the days truly of those magnificent men and their flying machines. If you could think it, you could do it. It was conquering the sky on the wings of a frontier.
After their first flight in 1903, lasting just 12 seconds, the public cries of flight's impossibility rapidly gave way to protests of its danger.
It must have been absolutely nerve-wracking for a pilot to be doing what he was doing with brand new aircraft.
The Wright brothers had promised their father to never fly together in the event of a fatal crash. To help soothe public sentiments, the brothers brashly toured full-scale model planes from city to city in empty fields across the country. Buoyed by a traveling caravan of circus tents, musicians, and a carnival-like atmosphere, Ben finally saw his first plane up close.
You had to be a little brave back then, a little bold, maybe a little silly. People still see pilots as a little goofy for wanting to strap themselves into a small airplane and go fly around.
Ole never joined his son. Flight, he believed, was little more than a dangerous novelty. His children were raised to value education and service above adventure. World War I, an unimaginable horror beyond previous scale or comprehension. In just a few short years, the relentless drumbeat of war would become impossible to ignore, even in Hatton. Bold headlines and radio announcements breathlessly reported more than 10 million dead, including casualties from newly introduced gas and chemical weapons. For the first time, Zeppelins and airplanes peppered the air above the front lines.
World War I started vying for that opinion that aviation was going to be very important down the road.
When the United States finally entered the war in 1917, Carl Ben Eielson's college education took a back seat.
Carl Ben Eielson enlisted in the United States Army in World War I. He was in the air service of the Army, and that is where he attained his skills for flying.
At the start of World War I, the United States had only 55 planes. Eventually, that number would swell to over 3,000. An abrupt end to the war reshaped European boundaries, returning thousands of newly minted American pilots home to barnstorm the country, making money any way they could. When a penniless Carl Ben Eielson was released from the Army in the spring of 1919, Hatton didn't even have an airstrip.
It came down to some visionaries. North Dakota had a very slow start in aviation. It was considered sort of a backwater area of the United States.
As one newspaper reporter wrote, the biggest threat to a barnstormer's life wasn't flying, but starvation. Over the objection of his father, Ben became a founding member of the Hatton Aero Club, the first club of its kind in North Dakota. "My son is going to be an aerial circus performer," Ole would say.
Barnstorming basically is an act. It's almost a circus act. You're flying it, right over barns. They're sleeping out under their airplanes in a pasture. They flew to different towns. They're basically nomads of the day.
They entertained people at celebrations around the tri-state area. Carl Ben Eielson probably gave a lot of people their first airplane experience.
Whole towns would show up back in North Dakota. Unfortunately, they saw a large amount of fatalities, in barnstorming. It definitely was a hard living.
He saw it as a terra incognita, or the unexplored territory that is literally the definition of a frontier. So he was drawn to it the way that, like a Columbus would have been drawn to the promise of a new world.
And for Carl Ben Eielson, that new frontier meant heading north to Alaska. After graduating college, first at the University of North Dakota, then later Georgetown, Ben set off to Alaska to find work as a teacher. But he was quickly seduced by the open majesty.
I don't think he probably realized how isolated Alaska was. In his mind, he could see, I could help these people if I had an airplane.
He seized on the opportunity to establish the first airmail service in Alaska, winning over skeptics who had long assumed sub-zero flight was impossible.
Airmail cut down mail delivery times from months or weeks down to days or even hours in some areas. You could throw a sack into one of the seats of the aircraft. You don't have to follow roads.
In 1924, with little more than a wing and a prayer, airmail service began in Alaska. Flight, it seemed, was no longer just for stunt pilots.
That's one of the reasons why he's known as the father of aviation in the state of Alaska.
But his next adventure would take Ben even further north, over the top of the world.
He received word from an Australian explorer by the name of Hubert Wilkins, who wanted to do exploration over the top of the world.
Even in 1926, most people considered the flight impossible. From Alaska over the North Pole to Norway, it was a feat the likes of which had never been attempted before. Their plane was little more than a bucket and wings strapped to a motor. It was so loud, the pilot and explorer could only communicate via body language, notes, and crude drawings.
Each time that they got into that plane, we see that they're risking their lives.
As broken radio transmissions were dispatched from the explorers, a skeptical public and Ole dissected news reports for any hint of trouble. They wouldn't have to wait long.
2 of the planes crashed, 1 of the planes burned, 1 of the news reporters was killed. I think we would view this as a total disaster. Ben Eielson, the pilot, looked at it a little bit differently. We didn't know exactly what we were doing. We didn't know exactly what we were getting into. We probably haven't done our homework.
A second attempt the following year would fare little better, stranding the 2 explorers on the ice for more than 2 weeks. Ben would lose a finger to frostbite. Hard physical work, danger, uncertainty, and anxiety had stilled our tongues during the march, Wilkins would write. Uncontrollable sharp cries of pain was the extent of our conversation. Battered and bruised, but undeterred, the pair would try again.
In 1928, Ben Eielson, the pilot, flew successfully from Point Barrow, Alaska to Spitsbergen, Norway, in 23 hours over the top of the world to connect Alaska with the rest of the world.
Eielson and Wilkins toured the country. Their return to Hatton was the largest crowd the town had ever seen.
Ticker tape parades were held for them in New York City, in Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, Minneapolis. But I'm sure the warmest homecoming was held for them right here in Hatton.
After conquering the top of the world, the team set their sights toward Antarctica, discovering new islands near the South Pole and earning the Harmon Trophy. But a faint radio call in 1929 would forever change history. A Russian fur trading vessel, the Nanook, had become trapped in ice near Siberia. Ben Eielson and his mechanic, Earl Borland, answered the call to save the crew and their cargo, more than $1 million in furs. For Eielson, the contract represented an especially lucrative salvage. After their first attempt, the team radioed that it would take up to a half-dozen flights to empty the vessel. Severe weather conditions hindered their efforts.
However, on the second leg of that flight, their plane went down.
It would take months to locate the downed plane. On February 18, 1930, 77 days after the search began, the bodies of Ben Eielson and mechanic Earl Borland were discovered near their damaged aircraft.
The funeral was held in the church in Hatton. The church would hold about 300 people. However, they estimated about 10,000 people were in Hatton that day of the funeral.
It was among the largest funerals the state had seen before or since. About a mile from the church, his body was laid to rest, just inside an archway bearing his name. School children sent their loose change to Hatton, anything they could find in their pockets, to honor the fallen hero.
His father completely changed his attitude. He had so much respect for his son, although he had the grief along with it.
Before his death just a year later, Ole told reporters, "I think if a man has been able to pack as much into a brief career as Ben did, that is compensation for not having lived longer." Ben was inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame, and received North Dakota's Rough Rider Award in 1997.
Eielson's idea seemed to be that a man should have the ability to go up in a hurtling piece of machinery and put his hide on the line, and ultimately do so in a cause that means something to thousands, to a people, a nation, and to humanity. Carl Ben Eielson should be remembered as one of the best who's ever walked amongst us.
Eielson was welcomed into the North Dakota Aviation Hall of Fame in 1997. His childhood home, now a permanent museum, still stands today. It remains a poignant reminder of a fallen hero and his humble North Dakota roots.